So just a few factoids. The first one I want to tell you is that almost 90% of flowering plants on this planet need a pollinator. Think about that for a minute. Fish don't need help, cats don't need help, but plants need help. They can't have sex without some sort of animal to help them do it. You probably heard 1 out of 3 bites you eat is thanks to a bee. That's why I have a honeybee and a blueberry on there. I also work in that kind of system. Well, so I was like, well, what about for animals? About a third of them actually rely to a large extent on pollinator-dependent fruits and seeds for their food. So if you care about animals, you should care about this. What I care about is that we know when we can assess them, and we mostly do this for bumblebees, that pollinator populations are plummeting in many cases. And it's mostly because they're losing habitat, just like for a lot of other things that are at risk. And habitat loss is usually coupled with habitat fragmentation, which is where the invasive species come in. The other thing we know is that climate envelopes are shifting. And so the plants and the pollinators are not out there doing their thing at the same time the way they used to be. And so we have spring ephemeral flowers coming out before the pollinators, for example. That's not going to work so well for anybody. Any flower visitor, anything that goes to a flower is potentially a pollinator, okay? And it's in proportion to how much they do visits. And so that means certainly in the southern part of BC, and I would say pretty much throughout our province, it's all about bees. And that's because they are actively collecting pollen and nectar to provision a nest. So they just visit way more than anything else. My second big section is competition with native plants, and I want to start with this myth, because I hear it a lot, that the wild bees need the wild plants. And that's not really true. They will very happily use something that's not native, really happily. And we've shown this in gardens. These are all things that bees love, adore. Plant them in your garden. They're non-invasive. It's good. But there are things that they hate that are introduced. So like all those bedding plants, begonias, petunias, plant them if you like them, but bees don't like them, okay? But they love some invasive plants, love them. And what we see is as broom density goes up, the amount of broom pollen that they collect increases. And the camas plants in the sites with high broom density have reduced seed production. And it's probably because of the way some of the bumblebees are switching in their foraging preferences. So my first take-home message is when invasive species are common, like Scotch broom can be, what we see is that there can be a pollination cost for native species. So invasive plants like Himalayan blackberry are actually well loved by beekeepers because they provide a lot of nectar and pollen that beekeepers need, right? This plant is loved by pollinators, but it can have a really negative impact on the pollinator community. Blackberry blooms in June and July, and it's an amazing bloom. Tons of flowers, lots of resources. But before that, it's vegetative, and after that, it's fruiting. The problem is that pollinators are not just active in June and July. Bumblebees are social, and they're active pretty much, it'll be soon, the end of this month, I think, in this part of the world, all the way through the fall. And I'll tell you, this is just here in the Lower Mainland, more than 140 species of pollinators collected off of flowers in these parks. I think that's kind of cool. 73 species were bees and almost 90% of the visits. And that's why I say most of the action is about bees. And there are particular plants that are especially good for pollinators. So on the x-axis is the number of bees we collected. So basically the ones that are further over to the right are the ones that catch the most, that we caught the most on. The different colors of the different kinds of bees. So purple is honeybees. Again, I care less about that. Yellow is bumblebees. You can see there are some things that get tons of bumblebees, right? The ones that I find most exciting on here are snowberry and salmonberry, because you can see there's lots of different colors. So we catch lots of different kinds of things on those plants. And these are easy access flowers is how I would call them as a pollination biologist. You can see the naughty bits. So my second take-home message is you plant a diverse thing with things that bloom throughout the year, and I'm trying to show, Oregon grape is early, and then, then the cornus is a bit later, and then the Nootka rose, right? If you've got diverse blooming times, you're doing something that's probably going to support a greater diversity of pollinators. So my take-home message is pollinators are important. We can forget about them because I know they're bugs and they can sting you, but more mostly they don't want to, trust me on that. Invasive plants can compete with native plants for pollinator attention, and so that can add an additional risk when we're assessing risks in pollinators. And we know that diverse plantings, like what Metro Vancouver is doing, can be really good for the bees. Thanks.